And you are welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. Due to the B team being stuck here again for what's the first time, Alan, in what, maybe 6 weeks, maybe a couple months even, that our famed producer is not joining us and host. And there's been a lot of rampant speculation about what happened the last couple of weeks. There's talk of him going on strike, us having sacked him. I can neither confirm nor deny any of those rumors. This seems
I
to be
thought
the
it was
season of
a
rumors.
I thought it was a third division Italian team he was going to.
It could be, somebody offered him multiples of zero that we offer him, and he just can't turn it down. So it's hard to say, but no, and is otherwise obligated today. Alan and I both have calendars which don't allow later, and you can tell by our looks today that we're a bigger mess than usual. I said to Alan before we went live, this is what I look like when my wife's out of town for a week. Um, so
Yes.
complete a bigger mess than a fat, ugly mess than normal. So well,
I don't know what
let's
my excuse is. I wasn't expecting us to do this today, so that's why I didn't have a shave. So apologies for that. And a new
yeah,
camera.
we
All these people are complaining about my camera. Hopefully, this one's a bit better, but unfortunately, it's a bit more real now. So that's probably going to put a few people off
yeah,
as
you're
well.
gonna have
So
to go to the makeup routine that End is on now.
yeah,
But
there you go.
well, let's
Get my
let's
hair
dive
coloured.
let's dive in. We'll start with another horrible, ugly mess, which was the game over the weekend. So maybe we're looking like this out of tribute to the Hamden pitch, but so give me your impressions of what you felt like watching it, and as I don't know if you've gotten a chance to start breaking the data down, and I'll be of particular interest because, as you know, don't get the type of information out of a cup game that we do out of league games. So I'll be really interested to hear what your take is.
Yeah, no, it was pretty horrible. Even watching it was quite tense. Certainly wasn't a lot of comfort in the game. It was, as you said, a horrible mess, and pretty much all of our own doing. I would say, a self-inflicted mess mostly. Why do I say that? So, you know, it was only that last Giakoumakis goal at the end that actually tipped the XG in Celtic's favour. 13 shots at goal. Kilmarnock had 3 on target, and that's from 28% possession. But the crucial sort of piece of data that really tells the story of the game for me is the packing data, because for the first time this season, and I've not looked back, it could be the first time for years, or even the first time ever, in a domestic Scottish game, Celtic were actually, had a lower packing score than the domestic opposition. Now, to give you some idea, this season, if you look at the sort of total packing score for the opposition and for Celtic, the games where Celtic have had a massively negative on that metric would be Real Madrid, Leipzig, Shakhtar, and Real Madrid. Okay, well, that tells you something. It also tells you, gives you good indications
What
how.
I remember this game from when my kids were real little. It's one of these is not like the other. So which out of
Yeah,
Kilmarnock, Real Madrid, and RB
yeah,
Leipzig, which one is not
yeah,
like the other?
exactly. So I mean, this is why it also gives you a bit of a crude introduction as to why packing is so important, because you can see it's a good indicator of team quality. I mean, the closest that a domestic opponent has got to Celtic this season would be Hearts away, where there was only a difference of 10, and then the recent game at Ibrox, where there was a difference of 22. But those were the only games in Scotland until today, till the Kilmarnock Cup game, where the packing score in Celtic's favour was less than over 100 to Celtic. So what was driving that? Well, there was one thing that was driving that, and that was turnovers. And we just kept turning the ball over, and we kept turning the ball over in dangerous areas, which also helps to explain some of the chances that Kilmarnock had. And it wasn't like it was a sort of something that everybody was doing. It was really contained within one part of the pitch, and I hate to use the phrase again, but we seem to have created a toxic combination on the left-hand side of the pitch, because you've got Starfelt, who every game, pretty much without fail, will at least once, sometimes twice, just simply pass the ball straight to an opponent under no pressure at all. Now, you look at this is where passing stats are quite interesting, because if you look at Starfelt's passing stats, I think he gave the ball away. He had 97% passing success, 90 completed passes. He only gave away 2 passes, and both of them nearly led to goals. One of them to Mackenzie, and one of them to Lafferty, who tried to score from like 50 yards. Now, if that had been Vinicius Junior or Christopher Nkunku that had been the recipients of those passes, you can pretty much guarantee that would have been a goal. So you can't look at the passing stats and go, well, Starfelt gave the ball away. 2 passes, 97%, but both passes nearly took the whole Celtic team out of the game and provided chances for the opposition. Next to Starfelt, you've got Bernabei. Now, Bernabei's a young player. I think we're still trying to get our heads around, what this young lad's like. But one thing we can see for sure is that, my goodness, does he give the ball away a lot? And again, it's just more volume with him. I mean, 72 passes he attempted, 87% complete. But in terms of number of turnovers, he gave the ball away a tremendous amount. He gave it away, I think, 3 times in the first half. He did redeem himself by winning the ball back a couple of times in the second half. And then next to them in midfield, we've got our good friend Rio Hatate. And again, nobody in the midfield gives the ball away more than Rio Hatate. He gave the ball away 5 times for turnovers, and he didn't recover it once to force a turnover for the other team. So when you've got those 3 in combination, you've got a systemic weakness there, and Kilmarnock punted ball after ball onto that corner, and they got a good start because they got a bit lucky in I think 3 long passes, which are a long pass is probably 80-20 in Celtic's favour, that they're going to win that. But 3 times the ball found its way to Armstrong, and 3 times either he did something where they got a cross in, or he was taken down for a free kick from which there was danger on that. And so all on that right-hand side, Celtic's left. So consequently, that packing score is driven by the number of turnovers, and although it got better as the game went on, those turnovers were almost wholly focused on that left-hand quadrant of the pitch between those 3 players. So that to me is just a weakness that any team is going to look to exploit, in terms of playing the ball into those areas and then waiting for mistakes and then breaking. Now, Kilmarnock don't have this, the players to do that effectively. Even then, they still created a fair number of chances, mainly from free kicks and long throws and so forth. But against a better opponent, and especially in Europe, we'd get ripped to shreds if we played like that in that way. So, there was a bit of variance that went their way. The weather was atrocious. There was a howling gale which Celtic were playing into in the first half, which meant every time Celtic rather stupidly tried to play across into the box, it nearly blew back to the halfway line. And obviously, every time they got a free kick, it was very dangerous because it was swinging in towards Joe Hart's goal. But all in all, we kind of survived that, really, and didn't suffer from that in the end, and kind of got through it all okay. But it wasn't good, and then it was a few, as I say, worrying signs there.
Yeah, it was everything you described there. I what jumped to my mind is that it was a completely different form of the problem, similar that we've talked to against those kinds of opponents in Europe, meaning that the conditions created a situation where changing how you play a little bit from a pragmatic perspective in a one-off game or in a small sample size of games might make sense. And to your point, I mean, again, I just thought off the Wyscout data that I looked at, I mean, in those conditions, you could make I think a reasonable argument that you probably want to go long a little more, especially given the inherent issues that we just discussed about, some players maybe not being under the best of conditions, the most reliable players playing out from the back. And then, when you've got cow pies laying all around the pitch, and the ball bobbling, and the wind swirling, and gale force rain pelting everyone in the face. I mean, yeah. So our percentage of how often we went long, the kind of the average pass length, weren't not that much different than the game that we played against them 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, I guess it was. Meaning that really, if you look at all of kind of the guts of the game, the way each team played was actually very similar.
Yeah.
But to your point, things like the packing score, XG, I mean, and I think the vast majority of that was the conditions. I mean, I think that is a reasonable explanation, because I don't think they played particularly well. I mean, they did okay in certain things, maybe a little bit better than they had the prior week. But as we joke, when you're the underdog, a little bit of the chaos merchant can be helpful, and that definitely was on display given the complete mess that the stadium was in so many different ways. Who else? So obviously with the turnovers and the conditions, I think we should recognize the positive impact of Hart, because again, that could have very easily have been an extra time kind of game. And I don't want to get bogged. It's up to you. We can again, despite some speculation, we usually just wing this, so we don't have a huge agenda coming into this. So if you want to tilt this towards some of the fun refereeing controversy that shockingly unfolded over the weekend, we certainly can. But yeah, I mean, I think Hart's with some, I don't think any of them were miraculous saves, but as he's kind of been at Celtic, he's making the saves that he really should, and they're quality saves, and they were important saves.
I think in context, the save that he made from McKenzie, I think needs to be called out, because that went through Carter-Vickers' legs, right? So that's a fraction of a second less. He's got time to respond to that, and it was right in the corner. It was wind assisted, and it was off a wet turf. So I think that was a tremendous save that he made. I think he made one other save of note in the second half, which I think, given that he parried it close to his body, I don't think was giving him a lot of trouble, to be fair. I mean, it was a nasty moment, but I don't think it was a particularly difficult save. But that one from McKenzie was absolutely tremendous. And he didn't really have any, concerns in terms of, fielding long balls or crosses and so forth. There was very little to worry about. So although they had a lot of shots, right, but they were very low XG per shot, because there were a lot of gate ball, and as did Celtic, right? We had far too many shots outside the box, or maybe not enough in the second half when you've got a howling gale behind you. Maybe that's where you do sort of play the variables a little bit, play the conditions. We certainly didn't do that very well, certainly. So I mean, in terms of things that went well, I mean the thing was, other than those two moments where Starfield, essentially under no pressure, passes straight to an opponent who in both cases could score, in every other aspect of his game, he was excellent, and he was easily the best defender on the day, in terms of he seemed to be the one that did all the sort of the mopping up and the clearing and so forth. I think he had 6 clearances. The next highest was 2. He had his defensive action success rate was 91%, which is easily the highest on the day. 10 successful challenges, interceptions was 2 more than anyone else. So it's one of those things where he revealed his usual weakness, and it could have been actually, it could have cost us the game. 2 moments, but in every other respect, he was excellent, and I think that's what you get when you're Celtic, in terms of what you can buy for 3.5 million or whatever it is. I think Maeda deserves a mention. I've done a piece on him, which I'm not sure where it's going to get. I might put it on my own site. Actually, I don't know. But essentially, although we remember some of the goals he scored in the last few weeks, it's actually his just overall game that's really stepped up since the World Cup, and it's just his willingness to make runs, his willingness to get on the ball. He's being less passive and a bit more aggressive in terms of his intent with the ball, and just the fact he was involved in 19 challenges and so forth on the pitch, which was about 7 more than anyone else. So he's just in terms of his appetite and work rate in that respect as well. But he was probably the best, most successful player kind of off the ball and his movement off the ball. Of course, he got a lucky break for the goal, but again, he had to be there and he was in the right place. So I think he deserves credit. My personal man of the match was Aaron Moy. Just for his all-round play. He was probably the most creative passer. He created the most chances. He had the best packing stats. When he did give the ball away, it was usually trying to do something, in an attacking sense with it. So he was probably the best of the bunch, I think. But it wasn't a day for stellar performances. I'll just mention Jota as well, because my goodness, I mean, he gave the ball away a tremendous amount, but it was always in the final third. But I don't know whether it's just not happening for him, or whether there's something else going on. But I'll probably do a piece on him as well, because I suspect that since he came back from injury, his numbers are way, way down on what they were before his injury. So I don't know if there's something going on there, but he's certainly one that it hasn't been happening for, really. And the last one I'll mention is Juranovic, because it was a complete shock to me that he would play, because it seemed like, with Johnson being thrown in at Ibrox and then keeping his place for the next game, that essentially Juranovic was just on the bench because Rolson was injured, because Juranovic is on his way out the door, and suddenly he's playing in the semi-final, and he played well, and he was very aggressive in his running. His carrying off the ball up the pitch at pace was excellent, especially in the first half. So that was a surprise, and then we'll probably come on to the transfer situation in a little bit. But that was something which kind of threw me a little bit, because I wouldn't have expected, and especially as Johnson had played really well in the two games, so he hadn't done anything to deserve to be dropped. And I get the sense with Ange that once you've got one foot out the door, there's pretty much no coming back from that. So we can maybe interested in your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it's So I actually agree with everything you said there as far as the various players, and it's it's always interesting. Again, back to the what I mentioned on Hart and the conditions. People respond. This is the human aspect of it, which again I always get a nice reputation as ignoring, for good reason. Not that I ignore it for good reason, but that I have that reputation. But is for Hart to maintain his concentration levels, which is always a very specific issue for Celtic keepers in that kind of an environment, which just standing there in that kind of environment just has to be a miserable thing, and to stay on top of your game in those conditions, and this is an aspect that's very specific to playing in Scotland, which is this time of year, somebody from Portugal or a kid from Argentina, a young guy, to just show up in Glasgow in those kind of conditions and play well and maintain your focus, and have that kind of same vigor that someone might have. All I'm saying is it wouldn't be shocking if there's a distribution of how people respond in those kind of situations, particularly given what you're used to with your background, and just an acclimation process. So again, whether or not Jota's coming back from injury, whether his head's turned, I saw something. Again, I was doom scrolling on Twitter with the Giakoumakis report from Fabrizio yesterday. And one of the ones was one of the, I don't know what the relative size or scope is in Manchester United fan Twitter, but an account with, I don't know, like 20,000 followers said something about Jota should be a target of I'm sorry, it wasn't Man United, it was Arsenal. Now that Mudryk was going to Chelsea, that's what it was, that they should be looking at Jota. So he's seeing some of his contemporaries that came in when he did kind of starting to depart for greener pastures, at least from a player's perspective, more money, potentially a wealthier league, higher profile league, that kind of thing. So, who knows what's going on behind the scenes. And it's not the question their professionalism or anything like that. It's just, again, we say it, they're just human beings when push comes to shove. So yeah, he's definitely not been as good as has been. And, it introduces a good question, because as good as Abad has been during his tenure, his minutes have not really been there. He has not been playing much. And, you've got Haksabanovic, obviously, I think still injured. His coming back's been, his timeline seems to have been kicked back. So we've got the James Forrest experience coming back in, and him being an important person in the lineup. So, well, anything else on the game? Because again, I think between the weather and we can talk about whether the some of the calls as handballs and offsides, and because again, I that's 100% your discussion, because I have no clue relative. As I've said, the laws of the game and the interpretation, they're so vague to me. Even when I do read them, I just have no strong feeling. I mean, I have my guttural instincts, but
Well, I did send the Yorkshire Whistler some of the incidents from the 2 semi-finals, because there was so many of them, and it's just continues to astound me that despite having VAR, we've still got all these really unanswered questions. So only one spoiler from me, not related to the Celtic game particularly, but he certainly felt there should have been 2 more red cards in the second semi-final than what there were. So I'll slight spoiler alert there. The only other thing I wanted to say about the Kilmarnock game, and this is, and I'm going to declare up front, this is not my joke. This is a joke I saw somebody put onto Twitter, and I'm sorry I can't remember who it was, but it was just basically about Derek McInnes stood there in the rain, and he just was he's the epitome of a 40-something-year-old divorcee who's trying too hard, and he's been stood up at the bus stop on a Tinder date. And that's just what he looked like when he was stood there in his regalia, dripping in the rain all afternoon. And I thought that was lovely. It's so funny. And again, I can't claim that's my skit, but I might have embellished it a little bit. I'll maybe added a bit, but that was brilliant. Well, I mean, fair play to listen. Two of the games where we this season we've had, even the 5-0 game at Kilmarnock, there was some. Some of the data was not actually as much in Celtic's favour as you might think. So he's played against Celtic so many times now, and he does know how to at least make life awkward for Celtic. So you've got to give him that. I've been taking the piss there. I'll give him slight credit for at least making life difficult for Celtic. But I mean, it was his call to throw on that absolute buffoon Lafferty, who was dreadful. And he really should have had Doigon from the start if he was anyway fit, because Lafferty is just he's a waste of space now at this level, I think.
Yeah, it was again. That's where I go back to the conditions. I think a lot of the conditions helped amplify the positives of his kind of man marking and physicality and basically trying to neutralize McGregor and force the ball into other people. When I say neutralize, I mean relatively speaking, the man marking of him and trying to make us work up the sides. So yeah, I
mean that was painful. I mean, in that first half when Starfelt was carrying the ball almost to the edge of the area, and then literally I have no idea what to do because I do not have a creative bone in my body. I've got literally no clue what to do now. It was absolutely painful.
Yeah, it's funny. Whenever that happens, I have, I grew up as my dad and I used to watch the Three Stooges on a Sunday morning, and I always hear Three Stooges music playing in my head, and Curly doing what it was, woo, 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 spinning around once he gets into that position, because it's just like this is not going to probably end up in something that's positive. We'll take not negative as being a positive in those situations. Well, so we'll spend some time on the transfer chaos that's unfolding, if you want to call it that. Maybe that's a little clickbaity, um, but we've got St. Mirren coming up midweek here, and fortunately, it's at home. They obviously being the one side that's rendered us defeated during the league this year. So, what are your thoughts as we head into another probably park the bus experience at Celtic Park?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is going to be a really awkward game, obviously. But I think we got ourselves into this mindset when we used to play Livingston, and then suddenly over the last couple of 3 games, really, there's been no dramas as far as playing Livingston is concerned. Particularly, I think and just kind of soothed the worries on that one, and I'm hoping that with St Mirren it will go the same way, because it's ultimately just the gap in level of player is obviously huge, but you can't. I don't want to dismiss them lightly, because they're clearly a very well organised team. They play a 3-5-2 in every match. They don't alter their approach. They're going to be playing a lot of long balls. They're going to, with 3 centre halves and Main up front. They're going to be, relying on aerial threat. No surprise there. They'll have hard runners in midfield. Although I did notice their captain O'Hara went off after about 30 minutes in the game the weekend. So whether he'll be available or not, I'm not sure. But they lost to Hearts on the weekend. But by all accounts, if you look at the data from the game, I think they had a higher XG. They clearly should have had a penalty for another handball, where it was the 50-50 coin. Fell tails for Hearts for St Mirren in that one. So surprise. And so by all accounts, they gave as good as they got in that game, and it was a very, very close game. And as I say, they probably should have got something out of it. And before that, they haven't lost. They haven't lost in 6 league games. Now there's only 1 win in there at home to Aberdeen, 3-1. But there was draws against St Johnstone, draws against the Rangers as well, 1-1. Against Livingston away, and against Kilmarnock away, and at home to Hearts. So that's a decent run of form there. I know it's only 1 win in 7 games, but it's only 1 defeat as well. And as I say, given their resources, I mean, they're one of the teams in the league. I think they're the team with the least disruption to their lineup. So what I mean is they make the least changes. They've used the least number of players all season. So they've got a pretty settled team. I think there's a lot to be said for that. So we know what we're going to get. And there's a little bit of trepidation, because I still don't feel that this Celtic team, other than arguably the games against St Johnstone, they scored 4 and Hibs against 4. It's been a long time since we've really blown anyone away and looked really totally convincing, if I'm being honest. And that's because Ange set such a high bar. I'm saying that. I'm not saying that Celtic are in crisis or anything like that. But we seem to be in the bit of the season where we are grinding it out. Which listen, if I look back over previous seasons, this sort of winter period is often like that. We've talked about this before. You said there's lots of variance around the weather, the conditions. A lot of games are packed in. You probably, because of all those things, you're starting to get more injuries. Celtic are heavily, as you said, reliant on maybe players from environments that with the weather's a bit alien and the conditions are a bit alien and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot going on in there. But at the end of the day, we've got a much stronger squad. So I just hope we can get back to being a little bit more convincing, I would say. I don't want to be dramatic, as I say, by saying we're in a slump or anything. I just, because obviously we keep winning, that's great, but I would just like to see the performance level go up. Even if we only win 1-0, but the performance is better, I think I'd be happier.
Yeah, I'd say the one aspect of our again, when I kind of look at trending metrics, which I've done over time, kind of like moving averages type of stuff, just to see if there's any kind of patterns. And there's that seasonality pattern, which again, I think the weather and The sun only being up for a few hours a day, which I joke is the 1 6-week period that I lived in Glasgow in my life as an adult. That was a shocking. Didn't I intellectually I knew it was going to happen, and then to actually be at my existence for 6 weeks was a different thing, and could definitely feel an impact on my mood and type of that kind of thing. But our chance, the amount of chances that we're conceding was so low. It's been so crazy low under Ange, and consistently crazy low against pretty much, almost everybody in the league. That has kind of started to tick up a little bit, and it's not something I'm worried about it, but I think that's part of what we're seeing is sort of kind of we're floating down a little bit. I think some of that is the seasonalities, the chaos merchant aspect with the weather turning bad, that kind of thing. But there is some evidence of that in the data that kind of I think supports that inclination that I'm guessing a lot of us as supporters feel intuitively. Relative to St. Mirren, they've actually done quite well this year so far. Again, if you kind of just look at season-long metrics, they're fourth right now in non-penalty XG differential, for example. There's a wide variance on that relative to results that always happens. But, if you kind of just look at underlying chance creation and concession, and I think they're fourth in non-penalty XG conceded. So that they're, given their resources, they've done a pretty good job in that regard. And again, just to put that into perspective, and this is why, I'm not very complimentary of who's managing Hearts, is Hearts has the worst non-penalty XG conceded per game, and it's not even really that close in the league. So I think they're getting by with, again, Gordon being a decent shot stopper, and they've had some good finishing. They've signed some decent quality attacking players, and they have guys like Mackay that are pretty good at this level.
Unfortunate. I mean, no, I don't think
right.
any team even have got as many penalties as they have, and
exactly.
They also seem relatively immune to conceding them as well. So they've had a lot of fortune in that regard.
Yeah, one of those old tilted VAR distributions that seems to be evolving. But so yeah, I again, it should be a game. The old 2-0 January grind it out would be probably something I'd be okay with. Well, let's go ahead and pivot to the tabloid stuff. This is the tabloid section of the show, talking about rumors and innuendo and reading people's minds and motives as far as what they're doing.
That's
as my dogs go berserk. Yeah, apologies. Why don't you have a say on what your thoughts are on all the rumors this week while I go to mute?
Yeah. So I mean, I think the main ones are really around Giakoumakis and Juranovic, and are they leaving, and what's the story there? And there just seems to be an awful lot of uncertainty about that. My reading of it is that if you go back and sort of look at the timelines, I think it was like the middle of November. Stephen McGowan in the Mail, who generally has a good handle on what's happening at Celtic Park, I think, announced that Juranovic, talks had broken down on a new contract, and that was just, there was no explanation given for that, because why, in terms of the quite obvious question, which is why are you negotiating new contract with someone who's got 3.5 years left on their deal, and then on the 3rd of December we signed Alistair Johnson. so 2 weeks later we've got a new right back. 2 weeks after it's announced that Juranovic talks have broken down, and then rumours started about who he's potentially going to join. We all thought because he'd had a good World Cup and Croatia did well, and he was a linchpin of that team, that would just accelerate things as far as moving him out the door. And then suddenly it was, he's going to Monza on loan. I was like, what is going on? So my reading of it is, and I wrote about this on the Celtic by Numbers site today, is that what's the most obvious answer, right? So I think if you look back at how the Juranovic transfer came about, we managed to pick up a 27-year-old Croatian international for just over £2.5 million, which was pretty remarkable actually in today's market. And if you believe some of the sort of sports salary sites, he's on a good wage certainly by my standards, probably not by yours, James, but certainly not top of the earners in the club. And the fact that we're negotiating a new contract sort of 18 months later suggests to me that there's been a bit of sort of give and take all round, and that there's probably some kind of release agreement of some description. Now, it might not be a specific amount. It might be to do with, if somebody from this league comes in for me, then you must. This is the limit to which we can. I don't know. I don't really know. But the fact that Celtic wanted to negotiate after 3.5 years suggests to me there was something they wanted to do to give him more money and get rid of a clause that was going to be problematic. And for whatever reason, he's decided he doesn't want to do that. And therefore, at that point, my reading of it is Ange says, well, you're either in or you're out. There's no halfway house here. You're either all in or you're all out. And we then signed another right back, right? So what's happened since is confusing, but that's my reading of what happened up to that point. And then with Giakoumakis, similar. We got the top scorer from the Eredivisie. We got him for under £3 million. He remains an excellent piece of scouting in terms of his suitability to play in the system that Ange wants. And again, he's got 3.5 years left on his contract. So again, early December, it's announced that contract talks have broken down. He's rejected a new contract. Seems to be the same position. We've brought someone in. He's not on the highest wages. We've not paid a lot for him. The quid pro quo, I think, is some kind of release agreement, and it looks like he's wanting to exercise that. Now he's continued to be picked. It looked like Giakoumakis was only making up the number. Juranovic, was only making up the numbers because he was on the bench, and Johnson was thrown into 2 games, even though he was straight in the door. So again, Giakoumakis seemed happy enough to be scoring. Neither player has really performed like they look like they're sort of down tools or anything like that. No suggestion of that. So it's just a very confusing picture. Maybe they've not had the offers that they want in terms of the clubs that have been in for them. And I know you've talked in the past about the sort of cyclical nature of the market and the fact that the market may not be as hot as perhaps we'd like, and that there just may not be the offers there that perhaps we wanted. And even clubs like Barcelona, who are got well documented financial issues, them being interested doesn't mean to say they've got loads of money to throw at it. They're sort of scrambling around trying to register players and being given dispensation by the Spanish FA and all this sort of thing. So there may not be as much interest out there, and it may be a slightly deflated market in any case. So all of those things may be true, but what I do think the evidence points to is that there has been some kind of release agreements built into these 2 contracts, hence the need to negotiate at the 3.5 year mark. And for whatever reason, a parting of the ways seems to have been the outcome of that, but that hasn't happened yet. So I don't know. That's my take on it. It might be complete nonsense, but interested in your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think some kind of mechanism would make sense. And this goes back to, again, just trying to be an objective observer of market conditions and the reality of where Celtic are in the modern landscape because of, something I think generally our support is proud of, which is the kind of the Fergus McCann legacy of being fiscally not insane. Right. So, there's a difference between being in the normal world, being fiscally prudent, and in football, it's if you're not insane, you're actually prudent.
Yeah.
And, because we run a fairly tight ship on the wage bill structure, and that really hasn't shifted much. So again, if you think about the inflation that's taken place in media rights, which is what's been driving all of this, TV money that flows into these different leagues, and that what that's done to kind of the industry wage structure, and Celtic have been relatively static over the last 10 years. So we're still, our high-end earners are still kind of 30, maybe 35 grand a week. And that is not what it was. The industry has probably sextupled that. and the skew on that is quite steep, meaning that, the top 5 leagues have detached. And even within that, you're now having the EPL detach in almost like an exponential curve. And, so this is when I mentioned last week about the fact that one of the names that's been talked about, or, look at who is being discussed as far as maybe in on some of these players that we're supposedly either selling or buying. It's MLS teams, Japanese teams, who's, those are salary capped leagues that have very rigid wage bill distributions, kind of artificially imposed. And that's who we're competing with at this point.
Can I just throw in, James?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Just throw in as well that Celtic, as are all the other clubs in Europe, are also bound by the new financial sustainability rules. Now, you rightly said that I don't think Celtic's costs as far as salary have materially changed much over a long period, and neither have our revenues. And that's I think the reason. That's the reason driving why we're not suddenly.
That's why I mentioned the media rights piece of that. Because that's where
we'll stick everyone on 30K, yeah. So just to recap for everyone's benefit, in 3 years' time, we need to get to a position where Celtic's spend on footballers essentially is no more than 70% of our revenues, and that's not 70% of our revenue on a good season when we get to the Champions League group stages.
Right.
That's 70% of, let's call it an average season, and we've got to decide what average is. So Celtic. There's a undercurrent here of Celtic managing towards those financial sustainability rules. I mean, it's not, and we're not the only ones. I mean, the press don't like to talk about why Van Bronckhorst and why Mickey Beale isn't spending any money. But again, they're having to operate under the same conditions, and there's no good doing what they did, for the last 20 years, which is, we're going to budget for Champions League football every year. That's the financial sustainability rules have been coded in a way that specifically preclude you doing that. So this is a new reality for Celtic as well, and we might be seeing some of the unintended consequences, or some of the consequences, not unintended for Celtic, because we've always stayed within the rules. But certainly some of the consequences for Celtic being played out in terms of managing that wage cost. I don't know if that has an impact as well.
Well, and again, this discussion, what I'm about to say, is purely from the context of, the birthplace of Adam Smith, right? Which is the greedy capitalist perspective, and in the sense that, if you look at, for example, you have to think about Celtic running as an operating company. They're a PLC. They report profits publicly. They have shareholders, and if you look at one of the levers, and again, the horrible human cost that's been the toll of the pandemic, and on the back of that, this cost of living crisis and the inflation. If you look at the season ticket prices of Celtic over the last 10, 15 years, in inflation adjusted terms, the revenues for Celtic are down, right? So it has not kept up with. So that, I get why people complain about higher ticket prices. We all do. No one wants to pay more. But when you're an operating business and the cost of, the water and keeping the lights on at Celtic Park is doing this, and you can't raise the prices either because your customers can't afford it, or you're morally committed to not doing that to your customer base, some mix of the two. Hopefully, like to think more in the latter, but again, we're dealing in the real world, not the pretend one. And again, we're a business at this point that's selling out every single game. So in that context, could you raise prices and still get customers paying what the higher price would be? They'd piss and moan about it, and they'd bitch and moan, and rightfully so, and understandably so, right? So there's only so many levers that a business can pull in order to raise revenues. And again, within the context of Celtic, we are almost maxing out right now. This is why I focus so much on player trading and all, because that is the only outlet unless there's some,
Well,
departure into,
yeah,
a European league of some sort.
Yeah, European prize money, essentially, qualification for Champions League. That's the only other game changer. But you can't.
Right.
As we've seen, that's subject to so many variances out with the club's control that you cannot put a 5-year plan together that says we will be in the Champions League every year, because we've seen for real how that plan works.
Yeah, and so that you can't count on it. So that again becomes that variable. How do you budget for it? And again, because we've been run, whether in the future being imposed on, but we've been doing it that way anyway, reasonably. So this is a long-winded way of coming back to this idea of how do you optimize the resources you have? How do you really and this is, when I wrote an analysis back in August about, again, maybe the rumors were total nonsense, but that there were maybe some English teams in for Giakoumakis poking around at like 15 million. And my point of view at the time was, good God, take that bid. If that is there for Giakoumakis, you take it, because you never know what's going to happen with market conditions. Player throws the toys out of the prom, as they say. Again, who knows what's actually happening? But we have not had a great track record of selling at good times, whether it was in Cham, whether it was Boyata, whether it was Dembele, even Tierney. I mean, we basically sold someone who was significantly injured and needed months to recover. So yeah, it's getting harder and harder. And this is why I wrote about it 3 or 4 years ago, which was this industry S curve as far as the efficiency in player trading is only going to get worse for us, not better. And so, the price tag, whether it's a release clause, I'm actually skeptical that it's a hard, fast price number. I think it's reasonable that whether it's a handshake agreement, because again, how are you going to get some of these players to come play for Celtic in Scotland right now, relative to selling the Champions League? Obviously is a huge benefit, but to our point, that's not guaranteed. Playing for Ange, the style of play, if you're an attacking player, you're going to pad your stats. That's something that you can sell. But as we see with Giakoumakis, potentially the market is not comprised of all dumb people. They're going to know that playing for Celtic under Ange, there was I retweeted it. StatsBomb put out that out of all of their leagues, Celtic have the best XG differential in their model, and they cover like 80 leagues around the world. Right. That's not because we have the best players in the world. Right. It's because there's something else going on there. And so it's, how do we optimize what we have to offer in order to attract the right profile player, sell them on, and to create, this revenue stream. And, I think what I'm actually okay with it, if we end up selling both of these players, given their ages, what we got out of them, which was good performance domestically, and, probably weren't going to make that much of a difference in Europe one way or the other. And we make money on them, and we kind of keep that train rolling as far as the turnover, as we talked about, the higher frequency. And if we continue to hopefully get smarter in how we're doing it. But, I'm writing a piece that'll probably go out this week on the Celtic way, looking at, comparing and contrasting Nisbet with Giakoumakis. And again, it's not an issue of which is better or worse player. It's how do they fit with the system? How can you reasonably expect someone with Nisbet's performance track record, if he were to play for Ange at Celtic, what might that look like theoretically? And where the value is in Giakoumakis in the broader market. And I'll put this, I know I'm ranting here, but I think you'll enjoy this stat, Alan. I looked at Atlanta and Urawa, kind of the two clubs that are supposedly interested in Giakoumakis. Their style of play is the antithesis of what Giakoumakis enjoyed at Venlo and at Celtic, right, which is the less he touches the ball, the better.
Yes.
And for example, Josef Martinez, who was Atlanta's primary striker last season, and their possession stats are 20% less than Celtic domestically. had 50% more touches.
Right. Eek.
Right.
That would get ugly after about 30 minutes with Giakoumakis.
Yep. Urawa's primary striker, was about 25% higher, but they only have the ball like 50% of the game, 52% of the game. So this goes back to the point that you've made, that he's been a really good fit relative to the touches that he gets in Ange's system. But would you spend $15 million to have Giakoumakis touch the ball 25 times a game? If you do, I think you're insane.
I mean, like you said, I don't know all the human aspects of it and what his desires and what his family feel about being in Scotland and all those things.
Absolutely.
that are vital, really. But from a purely footballing perspective, I would suspect Celtic is as good as he could ever get in terms of this fit to the style of play. The age he is, he'll always get good minutes. He gets at least 30 minutes. And as you said about stat padding, I need to do a wider piece on this, but I'm pretty sure your average XG and your average expected assists are higher coming off the bench than they are starting for Celtic, right? Meaning, Celtic's 5 substitutions against most of the opposition in that league mean you come on with 30 minutes to go, there's a good chance that something's going to happen for you. So, from a personal perspective, someone else has done the hard work in a sense. You're there to then sort of finish things off. So I just think it's an environment where he's liked, he's well liked by the support. His limitations are catered for in the way that Celtic play, and there are massive upsides in terms of his strengths and just the environment. If they could reach an agreement on the money, then to me it would be perfect for him to stay. To be honest with you, but it may not be all about the football. It may be to do with completely different things. So we just don't know in that regard.
Yeah,
I think you're right. I think if the market is smart, it's going to have to be a very smart and specific football club that's going to say he's the guy we want playing up front for us.
Well, and this is, again, I think if we put this back to simple human terms, if I think everyone's seen, or most everyone has seen or heard the report that he was on 11 grand a week, which again for most of us is a lot of money. But if your lifespan of employment is this, like he's not going to make that for the next 40 years and then get to retire, right? So he's probably going to make that maybe for the next 5 years, maybe 6-7 years, and then that's it. Like, what's he going to do for the rest of his life? What's his marketable skill? Like, is he going to go become a coach? I mean, academy coaches don't make a lot of money, right, in the industry. So if he's going to stay in football, there's not a lot of upside economically to staying in the industry. So is 500 grand a year life-changing money over, 4 or 5 years? It's good money. A lot of us would like it, but it's not FU money where you could say, oh, you know what? If I could turn that 500 grand a year into 1.3 million a year, I'm going to turn that down, right? I mean, that's insane. Who would do that? When your life, when your career expectancy is maybe only another 4 or 5 years. So if he can go to Japan and make $1 million a year, again, as a father, you have to, like, you got young kids and a wife, and it's like, how could you turn that down? That would be absolutely insane, above and beyond all the football stuff. Right. So, I mean, to me, it's just one of those situations where, again, if I'm Celtic, I don't want to pay him 30 grand a week. I don't think he's worth it. I'm not saying that's Celtic's point of view. I'm just saying that would be my analysis. Yeah. I think they can replace what he's doing for way less than that. I'm not saying we shouldn't spend 30 grand on a striker either, by the way. But I think we get one that's materially better if we were, and we're smart about it. So it's just one of those situations where it's probably a win-win for all involved if he moves on, and everyone's just be happy that he did as well as he did while he was here. He ends up winning, financially, and hopefully for his career and his life, for him and his family. And, Celtic moves on, and hopefully we do a good job in replacing him.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I agree with all that. I think with Juranovic, it's probably more likely that because of some of the names that were linked to him, the Chelsea's, Man United, Barcelona, Atletico Madrid, his, as the phrase goes, his head had been turned, and therefore perhaps and Ange would spot that like within seconds, sort of things. So there's probably a bit of that. Now, if the reality is that that's all been people looking, but no one's actually committing, then maybe you're faced with a different conversation. But we've still got 2 weeks of the transfer window to go, unfortunately. So we'll probably find out. But yeah,
and that's all of everything. People leak stories to journalists for all kinds of reasons. So whether that Romano report was a legit one, or whether that's a negotiating tactic because he'd prefer to stay in continental Europe, which again, given his he's Greek and he's got a young family, does he want to go to Japan, or does he want to go to somewhere far away from his family, or his wife's family, that kind of thing. So maybe that reported number is nowhere near what it's going to end up being. These things could all be negotiating ploys, and that wouldn't be surprising at all. So let's talk about Kevin Nisbet a little bit, because I'm curious. We haven't talked about this at all, and again, it might just be some combination of newspaper clickbait and agent talk. But what is your impression of him as a player?
Yeah, I'm not. Oh, okay. So I mean, there's a couple of things I'll sort of try and declare in terms of sort of being honest. Really, one is, on the one hand, I'd like nothing more than the idea that Celtic fills its team with young Scottish players. I think that's a great thing to aspire to. On the other hand, I do have a bit of I suppose bias really against other players in the SPFL. Some of it's to do with the fact you see them a lot, and therefore they don't seem that remarkable to me. And therefore, in some, you're almost sort of like they need to do a lot to kind of get my attention. I mean, I'm just looking now at sort of Nesbitt's data for last season in the SPFL, where obviously he had a bad injury about 3/4 of the way through the season. But he had 26 appearances. He scored 5 goals. Expected goals was something like 8.5. So maybe it's a little bit there that you sort of think, okay, so that could maybe get bumped up a bit in terms of his output. But he was averaging about 0.4 goals and assists, expected goals and assists, sort of per 90 minutes. None of that particularly grabs my attention when I've seen him play. Is there anything that stands out? I mean, I have in the past done quite detailed scouting reports on players that have played for other clubs in the league that I kind of like the look of. And the most famous. I say famous. I don't mean that in terms of thousands of people read it. I just meant the one that I enjoyed doing the most was John McGinn. That gives you some ideas to how many years ago that was, right? And to me, I kind of approached the article because I'd seen a lot of John McGinn because of the number of times what we play, Hibs and so forth. Very open-minded and not particularly sort of thinking one way or the other that, oh yeah, he'd be a great buy. But then when I actually dug into him a bit and studied him, I thought, yeah, here's a player that Celtic should really be interested in. But I can't think of another player in the SPFL that I've seen that I've cared enough about or been intrigued enough about to actually do a deep dive on their performances. And so that probably tells you something in itself. So I'll be honest with you, I've not seen anything. I would just think sort of more qualitatively. He doesn't have. I've not noticed things that doesn't have exceptional pace. He's not exceptionally either big or strong. I've not noticed his movement being exceptional. There's nothing about him that I've really thought, oh wow, there's a lot of potential there, sort of thing. Much as I am always keen to see young Scottish players and always hope that they'll progress and go on to have good careers. But that's just my honest opinion, and some of it might be just over familiarity bias. And I'm perfectly willing to hold up my hand and say that maybe it's just because I've seen him quite a few times and I've maybe not given him the attention that he may well deserve, and it's just and playing against a team that we're probably got 80% possession against, maybe he's just not caught my attention. Fair enough. But yeah, so I don't know. You've probably got a more objective view on that than I have.
Yeah, I again, only because I just did some poking around because I hadn't looked at him that closely either, because I don't spend that much time looking at players on other teams for a lot of the reasons that you just mentioned, unless something sticks out, like somebody's weird. Like I forget the guy who's plays defense for Hearts. He's an odd in a good way. I mean, he's left-footed. I forget, but he's
Kingsley.
Kingsley, yeah. Kingsley's kind of an outlier.
But he's about nearly 30 now, I think.
Right. But again, for Hearts, it's like, this guy's actually really good for Hearts level relative to his performance data. So that kind of thing, I'll notice once in a while. So I hadn't looked into Nisbet. And again, I'll just throw some numbers.
Yeah, I remember. I remember you asking about. I remember asking you about who was the guy that played for Motherwell, left-footed defender, and I was asking you about him because I thought, oh wow, there's just something about him I really like. I can't remember who it was.
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't remember. Yeah. That's my COVID fog brain.
Well, I could remember.
But so again, just for context, and this is a little preview of the article I'm writing. So over the duration of Nisbet's tenure at Hibs, now this isn't the exact games he's in, for the team averages over his tenure, which obviously he was out for a good bit injured. They've averaged 1.14 in XG per game. Celtic over Giakoumakis' tenure has almost been double that, 2.25. Okay, so much bigger sample size, obviously, for Nisbet. So this is an exercise, not as far as like a linear analysis. So if you look at on a percentage basis, and again, I didn't expect this to be the case. It was just wow, this is actually really weird. They both have been almost exactly 31.5% of their team's XG. Which I just thought was weird as to how similar they were. And relative to their style of play, okay, so how, Giakoumakis playing for Ange at Celtic against that competition versus Nisbet at Hibs. Giakoumakis has had, let's see, I have it right here. 71% of his shots have been within 12 yards. Okay, so this goes back to him having been, to your insightful analysis, which he was a perfect signing because so much in that respect, because we have so many of those chances are created domestically against Scottish teams. And Nisbet at Hibs, only 31% of his shots have been within 12 yards.
Right.
So again, you just think about that. The volume of shot, and now some of that could be he's making dumb decisions. He's not, he's shooting from 30 yards when he shouldn't be. But when you take the fact that he's played more of a traditional striker's role, where he's been on the ball, even given the disparity in possession, way more than Giakoumakis has at Celtic, and then he hasn't had anywhere near the kind of opportunities because of the system dynamics. So that's basically what I'm doing is I'm trying to normalize for a lot of that and say, hey, like, in theory, if a guy like Nisbet played for Celtic, in Giakoumakis' role, what kind of numbers could he put up? And so far, I'm like, probably not that much different.
Right. Yeah. But he presumably cost quite a significant transfer fee.
Yeah, I'm not even saying
all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I start out basically the piece saying, this is not what I want to have. I want to be more aspirational than this. But again, his profile, I think, would be for a third striker. Someone who can kind of produce at a Giakoumakis level domestically. My desire would be to have somebody signed that actually pushes Kyogo and maybe turns Kyogo into 1A, and targeting that depth at the European level, that kind of thing. But yeah, I found it a fascinating exercise because it highlights how different this Celtic under Ange animal is that we've talked about before and repeatedly. But that scope, meaning that 71% versus 31%. I mean, that's just a huge difference in the quality of chances that a striker gets. And I think we misattribute a lot of guys. You look at guys like Gary Hooper, you look at guys like Griffiths. Why don't we manufacture these strikers that do so well at Celtic and then go on and then because the situation really is completely different than what they're going to experience, and I think that's even compounded more based off of how Ange utilizes his strikers.
Yeah, I mean, Gary Hooper type of striker would be immense in the system.
Yeah.
But they almost don't make him like that anymore. You know, the role of the striker is, you know, almost even Giakoumakis. You don't see many people. I don't remember seeing many players like him, or you probably didn't notice them because they were just awful, probably playing in unsuitable systems, sort of thing. You know, because I even remember players like Italian strikers like Luca Toni, who, you know, very well regarded, lots of caps, won loads of trophies, but it's just a great big lump. You know, it's like what a career for just being a massive lump. But if you're a massive lump that, you know, stands in the 6-yard box and kind of bops it in all the time pretty regularly, then fair play.
Yeah,
So that's kind of what we need.
As long as they're not playing him as a false 9, right?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Well, we are up. I just noticed we're up over the hour here. So
I'm on overtime now. I don't know about you.
Yeah, well, I know you have a hard stop here, so let's wrap
we're in
this
danger.
up.
We're in danger of wabbiting on, aren't we?
That's right.
We don't want to do that.
Well, this is what happens when the adult lets the children around to run the show, like Enda has here. So, well, everyone that joined live, thank you. Everyone that listens, whether through Spotify, iTunes, you catch us on YouTube, at Huddle Breakdown on Twitter. Alan is Celtic by Numbers, so check all his volumes of work that he puts out. And everyone, thanks for listening and watching, and we'll catch you next time. Enjoy the games this week.